All right, hello everybody. I'm a little bit behind this week, but I did manage to read something that I haven't read in a while. So this week's book is called 8 Million Ways to Die by Lawrence Block. And this particular book I was led to read by a foreword to one of my favorite Nero Wolfe books, The Doorbell Rang. The paperback versions of the Nero Wolfe books from from Bantam Crime Line. They have forewords written by a variety of different mystery authors, in the industry. And for The Doorbell Ring, this one, the foreword is written, or I guess introduction they call it, is written by Stuart Kaminsky. And Stuart Kaminsky says this at the end of his introduction. Quote, returning specifically to The Doorbell Rang, the last line, which is also the title of the book, became my favorite last line of a novel, till Larry Block's 8 Million Ways to Die 20 years later. It is, like much of Stout's writing, deliciously understated. Ultimately, the Archie Nero novels delight me most when I feel that Stout respects not only my taste, but my intelligence, that I am in on Wolfe's ironies, that I can see beyond the surface of Archie's complaints to his insecurity and genuine love of Wolfe and the extended family. So, based on that, I thought to myself, maybe I should go check out this book by Larry. He calls him Larry Block, but it's Lawrence Block. And the book is 8 Million Ways to Die. So I went and I picked up a copy and I read it. So the title is repeated multiple times throughout the book, and it is actually based on the famous line from the film and television series from, I think the film was in the 50s and the TV series in the 60s, something like that. I didn't write it down. But it's a show and movie called The Naked City, a police procedural. And at the end of every episode, and at the end of the movie of that series, the quote, the thing that the narrator would say is this, quote,
there are 8 million stories in the naked city. This has been one of them.
So, if every person in New York City has their own story, then, this is the darker version of that same implication, that indeed there are 8 million ways for those people to individually die. So already we're in kind of a dark place, and it doesn't get any less dark, really. The protagonist of this book is a guy named Matt Scudder. He's a former police officer who is now an unlicensed detective. Not like, Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, where they're licensed and, they have to deal with Inspector Kramer and they can be a little bit flippant at times. He's not really quite along the good end of the law, like most of the people in this book, honestly. Another important characteristic of Matt Scudder is that he's struggling with alcoholism. So that's kind of another thing that is an important part of this story. So the way he describes what he does is that he does favors for friends. And he's appeared in a number of short stories by Lawrence Block, but he only had one prior novel appearance, which was called The Sins of the Fathers from 1976. This book is from 1982. I can't tell whether it's realistic or not, but it's a fairly in-depth treatment, look at what it's like to be addicted to alcohol, I guess. I don't know whether it necessarily rings true or not, but, Lawrence Block seems to think that it does, or seems to imply that it does. And yet, even without, being able to relate to him in the sense of addiction, Matt Scudder is a fairly sympathetic character. He's a good guy, kind of, at core, even though he, doesn't necessarily play by all. That makes him sound like some cliched detective from a bad TV show. I mean, it's not that he doesn't play by the rules, it's that, the world doesn't let him play by the rules, is a better way to put it, and a little bit more sympathetic to him. He's not like a loose cannon or anything, he's actually very detailed, and the way that this story proceeds is actually very, where Wolfe's stories can be kind of funny and flippant at times, there's a lot of humor, a lot of, self-deprecation or mutual deprecation of Wolfe and Archie. This book doesn't really have that. It's more, I would say, sedate in a way, and it's also a lot kind of more dreary as well. It's not a book where you find yourself chuckling at some little reference. Even though there are references, they're not generally made to be comic relief. There isn't, practically any comic relief in the whole book. But Matt Scudder seems like a good guy for the most part. He sends money to his ex-wife for her and his son. He tithes, even though he's not necessarily the member of any specific church. He's considerate, I guess is a way to put it. He's a very considerate character who, he's despite his like numbness due to his addiction and due to his own kind of personal despair, he never lets that bleed out into his treatment of other people for the most part. He's got a lot of fragility. He's got a lot of stubbornness. He's got a lot of despair and circumstances that kind of justify a certain amount of despair. But he's also thoughtful. He's tenacious, and he's a good diplomat too, which is another interesting characteristic of Scudder. This book portrays as a setting, it's kind of a portrait of New York City at one of its lowest points. Nearly every character that we see in this book is some kind of outlaw. Pimps, thieves, hookers, drug addicts, murderers, etc. We also, when we're not dealing with actual like criminals, we're dealing with people who are in Alcoholics Anonymous, and so a lot of them have sad stories and sad circumstances of their own. It's one of those things where Matt goes to the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, but he doesn't actually really speak. He just kind of sits and says, I'll pass. I just want to listen today. And even when this is portrayed as like a positive aspect or a positive influence on his life, there's still a lot of cynicism about getting and staying clean and about how people treat you. In the book, they're like, well, you get up and you say, I've been clean for 9 days, and they say the same thing to you as if you get up and say, I've been clean for 9 years, right? It's just like, it gets a little bit repetitive, and the characters, including Matt Scudder, notice. The tone of this book is very dark and very depressing, but not quite as desperate as, something like On the Beach, where it's just kind of like impending doom. It's just very sad. A lot of things that are going on are very sad. There's a lot of people who have made their way to where they are, but often it's because of their own bad decisions. And so, your ability to, you can sympathize with them, but you also can recognize that part of them being there is their own fault. Whereas in like On the Beach, none of those characters had anything to do with what caused their eventual demise. At the same time, even though there's a lot of despair and a lot of hopelessness, there's a certain dullness to it, a certain like numbness. Matt's narration is very detached in a lot of ways. And the way I kind of think of it is like, you get those authors that want to be like dark and gritty, right? And so they say the most shocking thing in the most vivid and blunt language that they possibly can. Whereas this book tends to kind of like, things are a little smoother than that, but you feel like there's still something biting underneath. It's like the difference between like wet sandpaper, which would be this book, and dry sandpaper, which would be like Alien: The Cold Forge. Matt's narration, we experience the world through Matt's narration. It is vivid and full of like personal anecdotal references, as well as a lot of very strong kind of, metaphor is not quite the right word, but like figurative language, right? So whenever something important is being displayed, we always get something that kind of helps to drive the significance of it home. It's very well done, I would say. It lacks, when you think of film noir or noir books, right? You think of kind of like that sharp characteristic of the narration, and that sharpness isn't really present in this book for the most part. There are a few points where there's a very graphic description of something happening, but they're scattered throughout the book, and there's only a few of them. Generally speaking, this, the sadness in this book is dull rather than biting. Another thing that is interesting about this book that I didn't expect when I started reading it for the first time, this is my second time reading it, is that this book, even though it is kind of a mystery, it actually lacks the structure of a whodunit. This is not a book where you're going to be like, oh, I know who the killer is. In fact, there's a lot of questioning and uncertainty throughout the entirety of the book, and then things kind of fall into place at near the end. I'll say more in the spoiler section, but it's not one of those books where you're going to sit and try to determine who the murderer is early on. You'll get some clues, but they won't actually lead you to like the terminus of that discovery, of that determination. Honestly, the book is more about the human drama of what's going on in Matt Scudder's life. And, we're constantly reminded of that by the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings that Scudder is attending. And these are interesting because what they do is they either kind of pull the reader away from the current plot, or what happens is that someone says something during the meeting that Matt applies to the case. And so the meetings are given a different meaning through Matt's interpretation of them, vis-a-vis the ongoing plot. The pace is slow, but the only real pauses are these AA meetings. There's a lot of consistency to the pacing. You never feel like, here's another 20 pages of nothing happening. There's always something happening. It's not always necessarily like, let's push through to the next stage of the mystery. But sometimes, he's just got to talk to somebody, or he can't find somebody, so he has to kind of try to figure out how to track them down. There's a lot of detective work in the book, but it's not structured like a whodunit, even though you might think that based on looking at the book. A non-spoiler kind of version of the plot, kind of a back-of-the-book plot synopsis of just the beginning, is that the book opens with a woman asking Matt to help her convince her pimp to let her leave that lifestyle. And so Matt spends a good amount of time trying to find this guy whose name is supposedly Chance. And it leads to a confrontation, but a confrontation that's more anticlimactic than you might have thought. Chance is like, yeah, sure, I wouldn't hold anybody against their will. They work for me, but that doesn't mean that I have a claim on them. And then, she says, okay, great, I guess I'm free, thanks for helping me with that. And all the time, Matt Scudder is kind of like, I don't know that you really needed my help at all. But the thing is that a couple of days later, she turns up murdered. And that is the kind of inciting event for the whole rest of the story. And, not really a spoiler that there's going to be a murder in a book called 8 Million Ways to Die. So the rest of the plot is Matt trying to figure out who the murderer is. And, again, it's done in such a way that it's not a puzzle for the reader, but it is a ongoing mystery that Matt is constantly working on, so to speak. I wouldn't call it a fun read. It's not one of those books where you're like, ooh, this is super awesome and fun, but it is very engaging, very well written, very interesting, and a good like snapshot of, well, I don't know if it is, but like the setting, the way that the setting is set up as kind of like early 80s, late 70s, bottom of the barrel, years for New York City, it's at least very vivid and interesting to read about, and it's a very well-crafted setting with a lot of well-crafted and interesting characters. Matt Scudder's voice is very unique. You don't get a lot of characters that are, both addicted. Like you get, I don't know. I mean, like you get stories where people are fighting addiction, and you get people where stories are like just in the thrall of addiction. But like Scudder's voice is very unique. He's kind of in the thrall of addiction, but also very repentant about it, very worried about it. And we get to kind of go along with him as the reader and experience his own personal growth. The characters, there's actually some good character development of the people who make it through the story, I guess is the way I'll put it. And even though the setting is probably a little bit exaggerated, it does feel very real, very, again, gritty, but with a bit of numbness to blunt it a little bit for you. So with that, I think we'll finish the non-spoiler section and we'll move on to spoilers, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the story in detail if you want to hear it. So here we go. Okay, as for spoilers, I mean, I already mentioned at the beginning that Matt meets Chance, and he does it on behalf of Kim Dakinen, who is the name of the woman who wants to stop working for Chance, to help her get away from that life, and then she's suddenly killed. And it's an extremely gruesome death, something like 66 slices with a machete or something like that. The first prime suspect is Chance himself, as you might expect. But the problem is that, number one, he has an alibi, and, so it's suspected, oh, well, maybe he hired somebody. But then there's kind of a turnaround where Chance, basically, early in the story, Matt spent a good amount of time trying to find Chance. And then once this all happens, Matt kind of detaches from the whole thing. He's like, oh, this is, I'm totally torn up by this. This Chance guy killed her, and he's not going to get any punishment for it. And what are we supposed to do here? But then what ends up happening is that Chance tracks down Matt himself, and kind of says, no, I try to basically plead with him, no, I didn't have anything to do with this, and I want you to prove it, kind of thing. So that's kind of the start of how things are set up in this book for the rest of the plot. What follows after Chance hires Matt is kind of this very logical and realistic slog through the evidence. There's various connections that need to be tracked down. Some of them are real, some of them are kind of guesses. There's all kinds of leads that need to be, run down and try to figure out whether they lead anywhere, whether they give us a clue to the identity of the murderer. At the beginning, and for a good chunk of the book, actually, things don't seem to really go anywhere, in fact. And of course, what happens is that Matt, speaking as the narrator, cautions the reader that this is usually how it feels. You're grabbing a bunch of facts that don't seem to fit together in any way, but at some point, you grab enough facts and two of them snap in, and then a third one snaps in, and then a fourth one, and then a fifth one, and so on. And so, these hints that he's getting, these little clues, may not make any sense right now, but the idea is that later on, they may come together in some unique way and make sense later on. As Matt goes through trying to solve this mystery, he's always reading the paper, and the one thing that is always in the front page of the paper is somebody, being killed in some senseless way. And he's always commenting on how senseless all of these deaths in the city are. There's a short aside about a guy who found a television on the in the trash pile outside of a house, and he's like, this television looks perfectly good. And so he picks up the television, he brings it home to his girlfriend. He's like, I got a free TV, it was in the trash and it looks perfectly fine. And they turn it on and there's actually a bomb in it, right? There's a bunch of different, criminal factions in New York City that are all kind of doing stuff and the regular people often find themselves in the crossfire. Eventually, as Matt is kind of, gradually working his way through the different things that might be clues, another one of Chance's girls commits suicide. And this leads to another set of questions as to whether it was really suicide, whether there's anything else going on, whether, she's connected in some way to what happened to Kim, etc., etc., etc. Throughout the book, Matt is investigating and interviewing various people, and all of these people are actually, these kind of minor characters are generally very colorful. They have distinct outlooks on life. There's a guy who is an information dealer, and he would be a black man if not for the fact that he were an albino, right? And his drink of choice is ice cold vodka. Without any ice, but it's got to be kept in a refrigerator. And he's an information dealer, and so there's a lot of stuff going on with him. We get interviews of all the other people that work for Chance, and while there is a lot of color and there's a lot of kind of distinct outlooks on life, the end result is still very dreary. Things are not good, and people are not happy. And because of this, and because of the darkness of what he's getting himself into, Matt is always tempted to drink, and basically drink himself into a stupor. He ends up getting some help from a police officer whose name is Joe Durkin, which I don't know if it's a Wolf reference or not, but Joe Durkin actually helps Matt get access to some things that otherwise he wouldn't have access to. They start trying to figure out, can we track down the person who's going to these hotels, who went to this hotel and killed this person, or killed Kim? Can we track down anything based on his, not forged, but fraudulent, right, registration? He signed some random name, and the question is whether, of course, that's not the actual name of the killer, but can we do handwriting analysis? Can we trace the car? Lots of things like that are going on, and he gets a little bit of help from the police because he basically talks to Durkin. He's like, you guys aren't really going to do anything with this case, are you? And Durkin kind of has to admit, sadly, no, there's not really much in the way of leads. and the amount of time that we'd have to spend on it is so prohibitively large that, we have so many other cases that we have to deal with. And Matt's like, well, I'm only focused on this one particular case. So if you'll help me out, right, you can have all the credit. I'll do a lot of the legwork for you, and we can maybe actually solve this thing. And so they kind of have this working relationship that works out pretty well. As the story goes on, Matt himself starts getting threats. He's at an AA meeting, and someone walks out and tells him a cryptic message to basically lay off. There's a point where Matt has just gotten a bunch of money from Chance to do the job, and basically some guy attempts to rob Matt, and that is like probably the most visually vivid and violent scene in the whole story. It's actually a little bit stomach churning. Another thing that happens is that there's a hotel employee who goes missing, and the question is he connected or not? Is this murder and this suicide, are these two events connected? Is either of these events connected with the guy going missing? There's a lot of questions, and most of them are left open until the very, very, very end of the book. We end up with another person killed with the same mode of killing. And then basically what happens at the end of the book, and I'm going to say the end of the book is not quite as satisfying as Kaminsky's introduction to The Doorbell Ring suggests, at least to me. All the pieces kind of fall into place like without a sound, right? Like all of a sudden it's like, bam, oh, that's the solution. And the solution is weird because it doesn't even necessarily tell you who done it, but it only tells you how done it and how to expect the next done it, if that makes sense. The ending is almost abrupt in the sense that we get a couple of missing scenes that are framed in a way to kind of mislead the reader. It feels like a kind of a cheap trick reading it. It felt that way the first time, and it felt like that the second time as well. You basically read a chapter and a half, and you have this impression that something is happening, only to find that the exact opposite is actually happening, and your perception as a reader was turned 180 degrees away from reality, which is the only time that this really happens in this book. And so it feels very cheap trick-like. It's like when Sherlock Holmes knows the dirt from some random place in England. You're like, well, I could not possibly have ever known that. So, obviously this is, you kind of give up, right? And so it's very weird to put this tricky bit right near the end of the book, right when things are falling into place, to make the reader then feel like giving up. That doesn't seem like a necessarily good way to deal with that. So I think that's probably the point that I found least least enjoyable, least satisfying of the whole book. And it's a shame and a pity to put that right at the end when things are actually falling into place. We end up with a final confrontation with the killer. This leads, and then what happens after the confrontation with the killer actually leads to a lot of the characters in the book that Matt has dealt with in this investigation. A lot of them decide to basically turn over a new leaf and improve their own lives. And so you get this impression that Matt has indirectly caused all of these people to kind of have better lives, despite the fact that there were a couple of people that he couldn't save, kind of thing. And then in the end, Matt improves his own life too by kind of admitting that he has a problem. And that's how the book ends. It's not as, like, I guess I don't connect to it as well as Stuart Kaminsky does, right? Stuart Kaminsky said that The Doorbell Ring was his favorite closing line until he read this book. And when I got to the end of this book and I saw the final line of the book, it didn't hit me in the same way that The Doorbell Rang. Order of magnitude difference kind of thing. And I think maybe that's because I don't sympathize as much with Matt's addiction problem. But, maybe if you read the book, you'll think differently. Maybe Stuart Kaminsky, gets it more than I do for whatever reason. So with that, we'll call it a close on the spoiler section. I tried not to spoil the ending too much. And it's still, like, while I say the ending is not especially satisfying, it still does tie up the loose ends, and it still does work. It just isn't kind of what I was expecting. And that turnaround thing where Block is misleading you for a chapter does kind of stick in my craw. Maybe it wouldn't if you read it yourself. Anyway, let's finish the spoiler section and move on to the conclusion. In conclusion, this is a very well-written story. It is a very interesting story with a lot of complexity, but again, it's very different from the mysteries you might be used to if you spend a lot of time reading Stout, or Agatha Christie, or Arthur Conan Doyle. It's not really the same kind of mystery. It's not a whodunit in the same sense, and it doesn't fall into the kind of the noir tropes either. It avoids both of these, and that's both to a good point and it has good points and bad points about it. This story is about flawed people living flawed lives in a flawed place as best they can, and there's kind of a murder mystery in the midst of that. Matt as a character is almost numb to it all. He's seen a lot, and he used to be a cop and now he's an unlicensed detective, and there's a good reason for that. And it affects his ability to kind of connect with people, I guess. But at the same time, he's kind of fighting to not give himself up to total numbness, which is an engaging, way to develop a character. Chance is another pretty interesting character. I found him to be, have some interesting layers, and he skirts a lot of the places where he could be stereotypical to be non-stereotypical instead. I found that interesting. A lot of the other characters that Matt interacts with also are interesting in various ways. They all have different outlooks on life, and they all have different ways that they cope with the despair of the day-to-day. And it's interesting to see all those different methods, that people are kind of managing to hold on. It has a somewhat weak ending with an impactful last line. I'll say that for sure. But again, the ending didn't quite grip me as well as the non-end portion of the book. There's one thing that I want to leave you guys with, and that is that throughout the story, one of the characters that Matt talks to, one of Chance's girls, is a poet. And she says to Matt at one point that poems are not about what they say they're about. Poems are, often an exercise in allegory or reference, right? And the same thing here seems to be true about a murder mystery, that it's not really so much about the murder mystery, but about, Matt and Chance and all these people, making their way through another couple of weeks, without giving in to the various things that could be an end to them, either emotionally or physically. And so this story is a lot more of a human story rather than a whodunit. So if that sounds good, there will be a link in the description to check out a copy of this book, to go grab a copy of this book if you want. And I hope you enjoyed this review, and thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.